Hi, everybody. I'm Angela Hughes, and I'm on live today with Dr. Katrina Swett. And her background is so tremendously gigantic that I'm going to let her introduce what she does and who she is. Do you want to go ahead and welcome?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, let me just say how lovely it is to see you, Angela. We used to have the pleasure of living more or less in the same general neighborhood up here in New Hampshire. I still live in New Hampshire, and we've missed you with your beautiful, brilliant, and exuberant personality and joie de vivre. So we wish we could lure her back up here to the cold northern climes, but Florida seems to have claimed her. So it's a real pleasure to be on with you. And thank you for this opportunity. So just to share a little bit of my background, because we're going to be talking today about my human rights work. I founded and am the president of the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice, which is a human rights organization with a number of missions and a number of specific focus areas, which I'll talk about in a minute. But our existence sort of came about because I am the very fortunate, really very blessed daughter of a remarkable man, the late Congressman Tom Lantos. And my father was the only Holocaust survivor in the history of the United States Congress ever to serve in the US Congress. And he will remain so because, of course, that generation is now passing from the scene. Even the very youngest survivors are now at the youngest in their sort of late 70s, but more typically in their late 80s to late 90s. And so in one sense, my father's legacy will remain really unique in American history. That background, that history, what he had endured and experienced made him incredibly sensitive to the importance of defending the rights of all people everywhere, especially people overlooked and forgotten. So he became the founder of the Congressional Human Rights Caucus. He eventually rose to become chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And after he passed away, the Congress reconstituted the Congressional Human Rights Caucus as the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission of the US Congress. So that's sort of by way of background. And when my father passed away, our family knew that we wanted to continue his legacy of leadership on human rights. So that's when I established the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice. And now we're going on our 12th year, which kind of blows my mind. I still think of us as a brand new organization, but that's actually no longer the case. And so that's my main labor of love, sort of the thing that is most important to me professionally in my work life. But sort of tying into that, I also am an adjunct professor at Tufts University in the Boston area.
And I didn't know that. Yeah, I didn't know that. Yeah.
Where I teach human rights and American foreign policy, and I also teach a course on international religious freedom, which kind of segues to the other really tremendous, fascinating opportunity I had for 4 years, which was to serve as chair and vice chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. So that's kind of a little snapshot of my professional work. I'm a lawyer by training. I worked in Congress for a number of years. I was deputy counsel to a subcommittee of the Senate Judiciary Committee.
And Yale graduate, right?
I'm a graduate of Yale University and law school, and I have my PhD in history from the University of Southern Denmark, because my husband, who he served a few terms in Congress, but he was also the American ambassador to Denmark. So during the time that our family lived in Denmark, I decided to try and get my PhD, and so I did that at the University of Southern Denmark. So probably more information than you're
talk about women. You're up here.
Oh, no, not at all. Well, you know, my greatest accomplishment in my life is I'm a very, very proud mother of 7 children, and now a grandmother of Okay, I want to get this right. I'm grandmother now to 8, but there are 3 more on the way. So pretty soon we're going to be into double digits.
Yeah, and you look 40 is the problem.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I'm not gonna correct that. I'm gonna let that stand. It's not accurate, but I love it.
So we actually came together because we were on the same stage talking about both of our works, because I do a lot of humanitarian work abroad and you're in human rights. And we actually merged both passions, my nonprofit Color My World with the Lantos Foundation. And we actually partnered together, just for viewers that are watching, and build a school in Pakistan, which is still going really strong. We have over 170 kids attending school there now, and they were all displaced Christians who were just run out of their land by extreme groups. I don't want to finger point at anybody, but extremists ran them out of their whole life. Didn't even have access to a Bible or any type of educational material. They were run out of their schools, their churches, everything, and ended up in the slums. And the Lantos Foundation came together and partnered with us, and we were able to just build a small school on site that over 170 kids now are going to, passing exams every single year, and making their way through. I mean, we've had it for how many years? 5 or 6 years now. So that's been like a great gift, and we were just able to donate several $1,000s to help them fight COVID over there, because it's running rapid through the slums.
Yes, yes.
That's going to be.
I am so full of admiration for the work that you do, Angela, and I think it's really just a beautiful thing, the way you've combined your love for travel and adventure and exploring the world with this wonderful, compassionate desire to serve others in places that are far away and very remote from from most of our ordinary lives. And that's one thing where, as you say, humanitarian work and human rights work really, that's the great blessing of being in this field, is that it takes one out of sort of our own comfortable existence and our own, it may be a lovely world, but kind of, limited, constrained world, and opens our eyes to the needs of people, and to the ways in which we're similar, the ways in which we are, all from a spiritual perspective, brothers and sisters, daughters of, the same creator who made us. And that is really one of the things that I'm most grateful for about the work I do. And I'm sure you must feel it even more, because you're so intimately involved.
And in fact, we're taking such a hit with, and I don't think people understand this. And when I was an adjunct professor at BYU, I used to always tell my students, like, tourism runs the economy of so many islands and countries. And with tourism down, it really affects, the livelihood of all people. It's just not about taking a vacation. It really comes down to the bread and butter on their table. Just in talking about that, so just so some viewers know who don't know me, we run Humanitarian Travel during the summer, where you can come volunteer and give back, and we make donations to projects, sustainable projects, to the same organizations that we've worked with for a decade. And Katrina's been a piece of that with us. But okay, so let's move on for a minute and talk about just the human rights piece in this environment right now, because I can't imagine, I'm reading all these things like, we're going to see biblical famines all over the world, and we're going to see people starving in the UN. And what's going to happen with human rights as a result of what we're, because we're sitting in homes and going, oh, great, I hope this ends soon, and we're all comfortable. But really, 99% of the world doesn't feel the way you and I feel today, and we both recognize that. And what does that look like, and what are you seeing?
Well, there are sort of 2 dimensions to the question you ask. On the one hand, the needs, the practical day in, day out survival needs of people are going to be horribly impacted. And, in our country, we've seen, tremendous impact on people's lives, but we have a huge advantage, which is that we have a powerful economy, still the world's most powerful economy. We do have a government that has the capacity, because the dollar is still the currency of record in the world. It can afford if you will, to, run deficits so that we can provide, whether it's extended unemployment benefits or the PPP program to help small businesses. We are in a position to do so. Most of the countries that are already struggling, as COVID begins to hit there, and it's going in waves in different parts of the world, there will be an enormous challenge for those governments to meet just the survival needs of their citizens. And so that is one dimension of sort of how the basic fundamental rights of people will be impacted. But, and this is more, these are more the kinds of issues that we focus on as a foundation. We are focused on sort of the underlying protection of the big basic rights of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, rule of law, and protecting, trying to encourage societies to build structures that protect these rights. And I want to give you one example of an issue that the Lantos Foundation has been very, very heavily involved with. We're really kind of one of the leaders in this field, which at first you say, yeah, how relevant is that, to what we're going through now? The issue is internet freedom. So you have a few countries in the world that basically imprison their people behind the same kind of iron curtain that we used to see in the old communist era. So, the world used to talk about the free world and the unfree world. And the unfree world was behind this iron curtain that kept out, knowledge about what was going on in the rest of the world. And people couldn't travel freely because, of course, their governments thought they'll never come home. That was one era. Now we have societies, and China is the worst offender, Iran, a very serious offender, Cuba, where people are kept behind a digital curtain, where they have no access to the incredible, just freedom of information that we now have through the internet. China does it through what's known as the Great Firewall of China.
Right.
Well, we now see, in the aftermath, or in the midst, I should say, of the coronavirus pandemic, that this is not just a threat to the free flow of information and ideas and communication, but it is a potentially deadly threat to the health and well-being of people, not only in China, but globally. So if there had not been this massive system of censorship and massive control over the internet, there's little doubt that the rest of the world would have known much more quickly, wait a minute, something very dangerous is going on in China. There is no doubt that societies, governments, countries would have been able to take steps much earlier. The United States, relatively early compared to other countries, cut off travel from China to the United States. But had there been a free internet, had there been a way for people in Wuhan, doctors in the Wuhan province, to communicate, to alert colleagues in the West, something's going on here, our government isn't being transparent about it. Think about it. Many of you, just like Angela and I, have probably off and on over the last 5-6 weeks tuned in maybe twice a day. I usually try to watch Governor Andrew Cuomo's daily briefings about New York, because New York is kind of the epicenter, responsible for almost half of the deaths and almost half of the infections.
Well, it's not even far from where we both lived, or lived.
Right. And then, I'm kind of a news addict. So most days, if I can, I will tune into the White House briefing.
Right.
I have a great power, which is if President Trump says something that I'm like, I'm not sure that's right, or as somebody else, I can go online at any moment and I can instantaneously kind of check it, backstop it, run my own fact check. There are all sorts of places I can go to get information. And if I have any question about the veracity or the reliability of information in one source, I have an unlimited number of options of ways I can check it. None of that is available to people living in closed societies. And so we really see, and I will share this link with you when it's published. So I'm going to have an op-ed published in the Hill newspaper. I believe it's going to be published on Wednesday. And I'll be sure to send you a link, Angela, and feel free to distribute it, talking about how internet freedom an issue that has always been important from a human rights perspective in terms of tearing down these digital walls, cutting through censorship. The corona pandemic has shown us it's not just important for protecting freedom, it's important for protecting lives. It's part of transparency and access to knowledge, in this new globalized world that we're in. So
it really was an issue before Corona. I mean, this just didn't happen with coronavirus.
Right.
This has been going on for really decades since we had access. This has just elevated, I think, the whole argument behind that.
Exactly. So that is kind of one of the big issues that our foundation is very proactive on. We are sort of the head organization of a coalition of about 70 groups and leading individuals advocating for internet freedom. And I won't go into, all of the sort of granular detail about the ways in which we want to see our government sort of step up to the plate on this issue, but I'll suffice it to say that with an expenditure of funds that would barely amount to a rounding error in the budgets of any of our agencies, the U.S. government would have the capacity to provide funding for these, I kind of call them internet freedom fighters. They're these small developers of apps that enable people living in China, living in Iran, living in Cuba, and in other places where free access to the internet is restricted, to safely and anonymously circumvent the firewalls that are put in place to keep them in these digital prisons. And these are, really, in my mind, some of the really very innovative and brave freedom fighters. A lot of them have to use pseudonyms and keep their identities masked because, of course, Chinese authorities, if they're in China, they would be arrested and imprisoned. But even those that are out in the West, they will be targeted. They will be found out. And so they need support at a level that it's so insignificant in the scheme of the amounts of money we spend, the billions and trillions of dollars. And, we're talking about 30, 40, $50 million that our government could use to fund these small entrepreneurial and very idealistic app developers out there. So that's one of the things we work on. We also are very involved in issues around freedom of religion, consciences, and belief. As I mentioned,
freedom of religion, because I want to spend some time on that. Have we made, let's backtrack just a little bit. Have we made any progress in human rights or in women's rights? I mean, I feel like we do, and then we pull backwards. And then yesterday I'm reading an article that we're still, mutilating people in Africa. You just read things and you're like, oh my gosh, did we not get past that?
Yeah.
I mean, do you feel like we've made progress in some of these arenas, or do you feel like we're disguising it under different things?
Well, there's no doubt that we've made huge progress, globally speaking. Certainly on the issue, say, of women's rights writ large, enormous progress has been made in recent years.
Yeah, and right. And these are really broad questions, but
they are broad questions. They absolutely are. One of the things, though, that is really important. So, as I say, I served on USCIRF, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. And one of the responsibilities that we have at USCIRF is that each year we produce a report, USCIRF continues to do that. I no longer serve on the commission, but it each year produces a report, and that's something you can find online at, uscirf.gov. And it's a very, very valuable report because country by country, it analyzes the state of religious freedom in different countries. What's interesting is when we talk about freedom of religion, I always try to broaden it out because we're really talking about freedom of conscience and belief. Now, for many people,
you say that before, and I like using that definition of it.
It's important because, for example, at USCIRF, we try to be as aggressive in defending, for example, the rights of Christians living in Pakistan. You know, you talked about that. Pakistan is an interesting country. It's a terrible country when it comes to freedom of religion, conscience, and belief. It's a majority Muslim country. It happens to be a democracy, but there are more people, and this is a shocking statistic to me, that this should be the case in an ostensibly democratic country. There are more people on death row for the crime of blasphemy in Pakistan than any other country in the world.
No,
That's
we know it counts just from Matt Gould, who runs our school over there. I mean, you speak out, you will be burned at the stake over there, really.
Well, yeah, and of course, the whole notion of a crime of blasphemy or apostasy being punishable by the civil authorities is in and of itself an unacceptable violation of the whole idea of freedom of religion. Now, a faith community may decide that, you know, we have these beliefs, and if you don't share these beliefs, if you're not orthodox in following these beliefs, then we will no longer consider you a member in good standing of our community. In that sense, a faith community has the right to, you know, not have somebody be any longer recognized as part of their community. But no faith community anywhere in the world should have the right to punish anyone for their you know, for choosing to, you know, change their beliefs, leave the community, reject those beliefs, criticize those beliefs. That is part of this much broader and deeper basic human right. To me, in some ways, the freedom of conscience is the most basic of rights, because it goes to our integrity as a human being. You know, it goes to that most fundamental freedom, the freedom to live life according to the dictates of our own conscience. So one of the things that that we often battle with when we talk about freedom of religion is making it clear to people that freedom of religion is all about protecting the individual's freedom of conscience. It is not about protecting the rights of religious communities. Now, religious communities,
because I don't think we draw that line ever.
No, people don't understand that.
In the corner over here and just go, oh, we're protecting our church, we're protecting this, we're, you know. And I feel like so many people, they hear like, oh, freedom of religion, and they have no idea what we're even talking about. I mean, can you dumb it down for us a little bit?
Okay, so freedom of religion, conscience, and belief is basically the right of any individual to freely practice their beliefs, either alone or in community with others, in private and public worship. And it extends to the right to teach their children and to pass along those beliefs and traditions and practices to their children. So, and it also includes, and this is very important, it includes the right to change one's religion. It's found, if anybody wants to look it up, I don't know how interested your audience is in this, but the basic international legal protection for this freedom of religion and conscience and belief is found in Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So anybody who happens to be listening who would say, oh, you know, I'm interested. I want to know more.
My son-in-law is going to be, he's listening if he's, and I'm sure he's going to look that up right now.
It's very short. It's not going to be like, oh my gosh, I don't want to read, you know, 20 pages of dense legalese. It's a very short, very concise article, but it has a very comprehensive, very inclusive definition. Yeah. And really, if you go through it, sort of those handful of sentences, you'll see how it protects the right to believe or not to believe. It protects the right to live out, you know, sort of the teachings and practices of your faith, but it also protects your right, for example, to leave your faith, to choose another one or none at all. So when I was at USERF, we worked as hard defending the rights of very often persecuted minorities, not infrequently, not always. And I'll give you an example of that. This is turning into more of Professor Swett's, you know, course on, but you know, it's just a teaser. Very often in majority Muslim countries, there are problems around protection of religious freedom for minority faith communities. So, for example, we talked about Pakistan. One of the most notorious cases about blasphemy and somebody being sentenced to death for blasphemy was a young Pakistani Christian woman by the name of Aisa Bibi. And she was literally facing um, execution on death row for years and years, but her cause became a real international cause célèbre. And she was about a year and a half ago finally freed, allowed to leave Pakistan. And if I'm not mistaken, I think she and her family got asylum in Canada. But her case was a very interesting one because it highlights the way in which when countries keep these antiquated, and Western countries had them hundreds of years ago, and they were just as wrong then. But you asked earlier, Angela, well, has there been progress? There are very few places in the world where blasphemy is still a crime for which you can be killed, sentenced to death. It's unbelievable, but there are such places. But in countries where they still have enforced blasphemy laws or apostasy laws or other, very problematic laws, it's also very readily abused by other people in the society. So Aisa Bibi was falsely accused of having slandered the Prophet Muhammad because other women in the village where she lived had a dispute with her over something else. You have cases in Pakistan where if there's a land dispute or a dispute about some business matter, one party will accuse the other of blasphemy as a way of getting the land they wanted, destroying the business that they viewed as a competitor. And so above and beyond the baseline just violation of human rights, saying, hey, if you don't believe as we believe, we're going to throw you in prison or kill you. It's also twisted and abused to settle scores, to take revenge on, a rival, a business competitor, someone that you have a grudge against. So it's just a terrible thing from start to finish. Another community that is terribly, terribly persecuted in Pakistan are the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. Yeah. And I know that some of the people listening to this broadcast, either live or subsequently, might be Latter-day Saints. And so the plight of the Ahmadiyya Muslims will really resonate because they are rejected and viewed as apostates by the overwhelming majority of the Muslim world because they believe that another prophet came to sort of further enlighten the meaning of their faith in the 1800s, and they don't worship that prophet, but within traditional Islam, the idea that any prophet could come after Muhammad is rejected. And so these very faithful, very devout Muslims, and I know so many members of the Ahmadiyya community, and they are marvelous people, just absolutely marvelous people. But because they dare to believe that God chose a latter-day prophet to bring further revelation, they are not permitted to identify themselves as Muslims. They are not permitted to have houses of worship. They are regularly targeted by the community. Their places of worship burned down, killed and lynched in the streets. They cannot vote. There are just so many fundamental rights that are denied to them. So it's it's a very, very alarming situation. And unfortunately, what we have found, and this is why another reason why freedom of religion, conscience, and belief are so important to protect, is societies that do a good job doing that tend to be societies that also protect the whole bundle of basic rights that we value.
Okay, let's stop there for just a minute because, we talk Pakistan, these foreign countries, and that's just a story for a lot of people. Let's come into the United States for a minute and just say, or just talk about like our rights being threatened for freedom of religion. And a lot of people think, oh, that doesn't have anything to do with me. I don't even go to church, or we're so like, uneducated or don't care or apathetic on some of these things, because it's not really about going to church, like we said. Tell me a little bit about the U.S. Just our people, because that's going to be the people watching here today, and our human rights being manipulated here in the United States. And does the virus contribute to any of that as well?
Well, the virus is absolutely playing a role. Again, some of your viewers may be aware of this, others not, but there have been huge controversies, again, a lot of them in New York, because the mayor of New York City has, threatened to make arrests, for example, when certain very Orthodox Jewish communities came together for the funeral of their very revered religious leaders. And you do have, and sometimes, we have to acknowledge it, sometimes rights can bump up against each other. That's just the way it works. And and in a free and a democratic and a pluralistic society, we sometimes have to figure out how we thread the needle, how we navigate it when rights bump up against each other. So if you want to talk about for religious freedom issues in the United States, probably the biggest controversies have tended to gravitate around the conflict, the bumping up against equal protection of the laws as it's related to extending civil rights to members of the LGBTQ community. So we've been moving very much in that direction as a society, both legislatively and through court decisions, just becoming more tolerant, more accepting, more desirous of making sure that all communities have a place, an equal place at the table. And I think most people of goodwill want to see a society that reflects that kind of an attitude. Having said that, it's also true that many faiths have very clear teachings about what's right and what's wrong and what's, acceptable and not acceptable around, behavior and, all of those kinds of things. And so where things can get dicey and where it can get to be a bit of a challenge is, how do you fully protect and robustly protect the rights of faith communities to teach their doctrine, to teach the things that they hold to be true, and not penalize them or harm them in the teaching of those things.
Right.
And at the same time, in our shared civic space, provide full protection and equal rights for people to live their lives as they see fit. And, I would say, again, this may resonate with some of your listeners, that Utah did a pretty good job with this. So after the Supreme Court decision,
I'm always super glad I don't live there, by the way.
Well, I've never lived there.
On the East Coast when it comes to these types of topics.
I know. It's interesting because I've never lived in Utah. I've had, I've lots of
people, but yeah.
Because I myself, am, kind of a citizen of the world, and I like that sense of great diversity and tremendous number of viewpoints and all of that. It's never appealed to me to live in a place where lots and lots of people share the same, sort of traditions.
As well, I like the diversity of
But I will say this, just getting back to kind of that issue, the Utah Compromise, I think it was called, really did try to thread that needle in a way that provided broad protections for members of the LGBT community in, public accommodations and in housing and in, any sort of business interactions and, in a variety of arenas where we come in contact with our fellow citizens and fellow neighbors in the public square, where everybody has to be treated equally, while at the same time, trying to protect the right of religious institutions, whatever they may be, Muslim, Christian, Buddhist. There are obviously a tremendous range of faith communities in our country and in the world, to be able to, as I say, teach their doctrine, teach their principles, and run and make available their faith-based practices around marriage and baptism and all of those things in accordance with their doctrine and teaching. So that's kind of been the challenge in our country. But certainly in the era of COVID, we've seen most churches, most synagogues, most mosques, most temples of various faiths have chosen voluntarily to kind of adopt the social distancing practices. And they have voluntarily chosen, not to continue holding services. But the question
in Florida, we have drive-in services though down here.
I beg your pardon?
Florida, there's been a lot of drive-in services and a lot of
there have, and we really don't know. And yeah, and it would honestly take court cases to try and ascertain the borders of how far any government can go, local, state, or federal, in restricting the free exercise rights of American citizens in a period of national emergency. So, all these rules that have been, placed on all of us are basically being done under emergency powers. And all governments have emergency powers, and during periods of emergency, a lot of rights that we have can be temporarily suspended. But there are limits on that, and these limits haven't really been tested because, as I say, most faith communities are voluntarily saying, yeah, we want to do this to protect our own members.
Right.
We don't want to put them at risk. But you do have outliers. You have some, evangelical churches that are saying, no, you can't do this, and don't tread on me. You don't have the right to do that. And just as a matter of the way we resolve these issues in America, we tend to resolve them through the courts. So somebody says, I don't think Governor Cuomo has the right to do that. So they file a suit, and then the state has to respond, and then a judge hears it, and that judge issues a ruling and says, no, it's a reasonable emergency order, and under all of these past precedents, the governor has the right to do it. And then maybe that person decides to appeal it to the appeals court, and then maybe it goes to the Supreme Court. So that's kind of the slow, cumbersome way we resolve these things in our society. Yeah, those are some of the big issues we're wrestling with.
There's so many things. I feel like I could just talk to you for hours because you're so just knowledgeable, so exciting, so fun. I want to go back to your dad for a minute because he has such a fascinating story. Again, if you're just joining in or you're just catching us midway in this broadcast, Katrina's father was a Holocaust survivor. He was a senator in the U.S. Senate, or congressman, yeah. And, okay, so let's talk about that a little bit because at the beginning of the broadcast, you said, we're kind of aging out now. I mean, we're seeing most of the survivors now near the end of their life, or if not deceased. How is that going to change? I mean, and the interesting part of his story, really quick before I ask that question, is your family was Jewish and then went Christian. So you have such an interesting background that you don't see regularly when we talk about Holocaust stories, etc.
Yes, well, my mother, who is also, so both my parents were born in Hungary, and I'll tell you a little bit about their stories, and then maybe address the question you raised, which is a really important one, and that is, how do we sustain our collective memory of the Holocaust to guard against the dangers of any such catastrophic tragedy ever happening again, when that generation has completely left the scene? And it's a hard question, and it's an important question. But both of my parents were born in Hungary to Jewish families. My father's family were more educators. My mother came from quite a prominent family, something that your viewers will probably find intriguing. Her cousins were the Gabor sisters. I don't know if you know Zsa Gabor and Ava Gabor, Green Acres. Everybody remembers Green Acres. And my mother's family was quite prominent. And they were childhood sweethearts. Hungary, initially during the war, was an ally of Germany. But as the war went on, um, the Germans, and of course, as the tide began to turn against Germany during the war, the Germans began to suspect that Hungary was a wavering ally, which was in fact true. And during the earlier years of the war, while there was terrible persecution of the Jews in Hungary, there was relatively limited deportations to the death camps. In 1944, March 19th, 1944, Germany occupied Hungary to prevent it from sort of flipping and switching sides. And that's when the true nightmare, the full nightmare of the Holocaust began for the Jews of Hungary. There was an incredibly heroic, brave Swedish diplomat by the name of Raoul Wallenberg. And that's another little, here's Professor Swett again. That's the other assignment that I would give to your listeners, to Google Raoul Wallenberg and find out a little more about his mission of rescue. He went to Hungary at the height of the Holocaust for the Hungarian Jews, with the mission of trying to save as many of the Hungarian Jews as he possibly could. And we believe he was ultimately responsible for saving as many as 100,000. And sort of directly in my father's case, and a little more indirectly in my mother's case, he saved both of my parents.
Amazing.
Yeah, and I won't go into it, again at great length, but they both managed to survive. And after the war, my father came to the United States on an academic scholarship, and my mother came a couple of years later, and they were married, but they had literally been childhood sweethearts. So it's a very beautiful and amazing and semi-miraculous story. My father, as a result of the horrors that he had witnessed and experienced, really became an agnostic in his life. But my mother, who had always been deeply, kind of a seeker, she began a quest sort of for a greater understanding of what the meaning and purpose of life was. And just recently, she shared her testimony, which is very beautiful, really profound. I'd love to share it with your audience sometime, of how she sort of found her way to first a belief that Jesus Christ was in fact the promised Jewish Messiah, the Messiah that her people throughout history had been looking towards and for. And then, how her further journey eventually led her actually to a testimony of the restored Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So my sister and I kind of grew up in that sense, in a rather mixed household, but we each independently found our way also to a testimony of the restored gospel, sort of when we were college age. So I was not raised in any particular faith tradition, but did find my way there. And so to answer your question about what does it mean, what are the implications of the Holocaust, the survivor generation passing entirely from the scene, I think the potential implications are very serious, because the world in so many ways has sped up, and the internet, for all the ways in which it's marvelous and just makes our life so much more interesting and exciting and connected. I think one of the bad things is it's also led to a shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter attention span on the part of most of us. We want the latest thing, the newest thing. We want it instantly. We leave the past behind very quickly.
Right.
It's always new. What's next? And the sort of philosopher, thinker, writer Santayana, he was Spanish, but I think eventually moved to Britain and became a British citizen. But he said very profoundly that, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it.
So, yeah.
And, for many, many decades after the Holocaust, the whole world, if you ever said the phrase "never again," people knew what that meant. That was sort of almost a globally understood incantation, almost, that never again will humanity allow something, a horror on the scale of the Holocaust, the Nazi Holocaust, resulting in the intentional murder of over 6 million Jews, and of course, millions of others, Roma, gays and lesbians, members of trade unions, Catholic priests. I mean, there were many other targeted communities. No community suffered on the scale and, this sort of racially driven hatred and desire for literally the total extermination. But it was, such a horror that's actually what led to the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Because the world, when the full horrors of the Nazi Holocaust were understood, they said, the world can't just go forward any longer on the basis of saying, well, every country gets to do whatever they want to within their own borders. We have to have certain global, universal, fundamental, international standards of rights that protect everybody everywhere. And that was really the impetus behind the adoption of the Universal Declaration. So, I don't really think we yet know how challenging it will be to make sure that each new generation is still taught what it meant. My mother, for many years, would go into the schools to teach about the Holocaust. Here in New Hampshire, we just passed, maybe 6 months ago, and I'm so thrilled. And, we were very, very much in support of it at the foundation, but they just passed a law that requires the schools to provide Holocaust education.
I love that, because I do just feel like there's this gap of kids now who just don't know even about 9/11. Now we're passing the 9/11 stage. Like, that's a lot, that seems like yesterday, but, and just for my viewers that are watching as well, in Budapest, we have a brand new statue of her father, right?
Yes, there's a wonderful
couple years, but it feels brand new still.
Oh, it's beautiful. And have you been to Budapest?
No, I was in Budapest, and I think I had just missed you. I think you guys were there putting it,
unveiling it,
and I think we had just, it came right before. So,
Well, if any of your viewers, or if you have the chance to go to Budapest, it is a wonderful statue that was unveiled 2 years ago. I think it's 2 years ago now, on what would have been my father's 90th birthday, if I'm remembering this. I think it was in 2018 that it was unveiled. So 2 years ago. But it's wonderful, and it's on the Pest side of Budapest. So Budapest is really two cities, Buda and Pest, and the Danube River, the beautiful Danube River, flows between them. And they're linked by, I think, 7 bridges. And this statue is on the Pest side. And, you can, I won't tell you the address because I don't know it off the top of my head, but it's a wonderful statue near the gymnasium. So in Europe, they call their high schools gymnasiums. And they're actually, I hate to say it, but quite a bit more rigorous than American high schools. They're really, really tough. And not everybody goes to gymnasium. So they sort of have technical schools that are more teaching the trades, and then people are more university bound go to these gymnasiums. And it's kind of very close to the gymnasium that my father attended, and it's a wonderful sculpture because it's a park bench, and there's a life-size figure of my father, might even be slightly larger than life-size, sitting on one end of the bench, and he's got a very serious, contemplative look on his face. But on the other end of the bench, looking at him very eagerly, are 2 very charming dogs. Because in addition to fighting for human rights, both of my parents were very active animal rights activists.
It's funny.
Kind of cute. I mean, my father was famous on Capitol Hill. He was the first to really start doing this, and then some other members of Congress sort of followed his example. But he brought his little dog with him to the office every day in Congress. So
that's why you dog lovers. Yeah. Okay, because we need to wrap up. Again, I'm speaking with Dr. Katrina Lantos Swett, who's a human rights activist. She's also heavily involved in freedom of religion around the world. She speaks internationally on every stage you can imagine. And we've been talking about a variety of things, from her father, who is a Holocaust survivor and was a congressman, to her work in human rights and even the impact that it's had on the United States right now with COVID. Okay, to wrap it up,
yes,
in just a couple of sentences, what do you want to see accomplished? And, what direction, what can the normal person do? Because, I fear sometimes when we talk about this, and because we've shared the same stage together, people get overwhelmed because these feel like gigantic global issues, and like, what can one person do? And I just realized in my interviewing skills, I ask about 10 questions before I ask the one I want to ask. But what can like the normal mom, dad, family do that's listening to this and just says, oh my gosh, I want to do something.
Yeah.
But I can't be that person. I can't go out and fight. I can do my little piece. What's the little piece that somebody can do?
Well, I think for all of your listeners, what sort of speaks to your heart. So is your great passion education? Is your passion freedom of the press? Is your passion freedom of religion? Is your passion humanitarian relief and helping people, who are struggling with a need around the world? Is your passion prisoners of conscience, wanting to do things on behalf of people who have been unjustly imprisoned, either for their beliefs or for speaking out? And because it's a universe, and it's overwhelming if you think about all the human rights violations in the world. So when you find the thing that kind of speaks to your heart, and it can be something domestic, it can be children's rights, it can be trafficking in women and children. Trafficking is a huge.
That is such a good one right now that anybody can do. And that's a path that I've been thinking is like, I should really, share my voice a little bit more. And sex trafficking is just so gigantic, and it's right in our cities.
A huge human rights crisis, really, globally. It's one of the most heartbreaking ones. Then I would tell you, and this is where, again, the marvel of having this incredible internet, you can literally go online and say, organizations involved in fighting human trafficking. And a dozen names are going to come up there. Yeah. And there may be a group near you that is looking for volunteers, or looking for financial support, or looking for people to write a letter to the editor, because maybe in your state there's a piece of legislation to address a more aggressive effort to combat human trafficking. So the thing to do, and I'm really glad you asked that question, Angela, is find out what's the thing that speaks to me. What is the thing that kind of really resonates with me? Because you're not going to deal with internet freedom and religious freedom and trafficking and, this, environmental degradation. We can't all do everything. We really can't. I teach human rights, so I have to know about a lot of them. But there is something that will just sort of, hit your heart, and you're going to say, that's the thing that I want to see if there's something little I can do. Some way I can begin. There's a great organization, Amnesty International, which is all about prisoners of conscience. And people would join Amnesty going back many years, and they'd be paired up with a prisoner of conscience, and you would write letters to them. And then maybe you'd get to know their family. You might send packages.
That's such a great idea for like families with children who just to become that pen pal. I mean, that's such a great COVID lockup idea for us to be doing.
Right. And of course, now during COVID, people are doing so many wonderful things in their own communities, making masks, right here in our little town of Bow. There's a woman who every day she makes homemade, out of cloth, high quality masks, and just hangs them on a tree outside her house. And anybody who needs one can come get them. And she'll just post, she'll say, I'm all out of masks. There'll be more in 3 days. And, so it's a great example of how people can just decide, this is something I can do. This is a skill I have.
And that's what I think is so, again, just want to talk to you forever, but we're going to wrap up here. But that's what I love about the Holocaust story so much, and about your family story in the Holocaust is, out of all of the ashes of that, there were so many great stories that came out of that, of humanity. And, and I hope those stories, A, aren't lost. And then B, I think, this is our own little war in a way right now. There's just great things happening, even though terrible things are happening right now everywhere. Okay, your final thoughts, just as a wrap up.
My final thought is that that crises don't necessarily, they can build character, but they also reveal our character.
Right.
And I would encourage all of us in this moment of crisis for the world to look within, maybe look to our faith and our beliefs to guide the ways in which we not only act responsibly towards those around us,
Right.
but to extend beyond just our own little circle in some way. And there's always a way to do that.
Right.
And so I guess that would be my final thought. I'll leave you though with sort of what's the motto of the Lantos Foundation. It was something my father said on a number of occasions, and it's kind of become quite a famous phrase, but it talks about how each of us has a duty to defend our civilization, including the rights of our fellow human beings. And he said, the veneer of civilization is paper thin. We are its guardians, and we can never rest. And I do think COVID has shown us how thin that veneer is. We thought we knew what normal was and that everything would always go along as it had. And you see how quickly that can break down. But we're the defenders of civilization's thin veneer. And whether that's, doing things for our first responders, whether it's standing up to defend human rights when they're threatened, think of yourself as a guardian and be ready not to rest, not to kick back, put your feet up, but to be a guardian who steps forward to defend the values and the rights and the civilization that we hold dear.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today on my new little talk show that just came to be when I wanted to talk to you. Well, I usually talk travel during the week, but I'm like, I think on Sundays I'm going to talk to all my favorite friends that are doing amazing things right now. So
well, thank you for this opportunity, and
thank you today because I wanted to talk to you.
Well, it's been a joy, and thank you, Angela, for just being the kind of ray of optimism and sunshine and kind of daring and bravery that we all need in our lives at this time. I think just for people to be able to hear you is a lift for them. So thank you. I feel very honored to be one of your first non-travel guests.
Well, there's just so much great going on in the world, and I think that we need to be talking about it with educated people like yourself. And it just gives me so many more ideas of, like I want to talk about sex trafficking again with you. I feel like there's so many, I'm going to make this maybe, next quarter again with you, because I feel like there's so many just great ideas that you're not only giving viewers, but it just inspires us to be better people. So I love your dad, Tom. So
okay, well, hello everybody, and great to see you, and let's try and stay in closer touch.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Okay.
We off? Okay.
Right.
And I'm not a professional interviewer, and I get a little on a tangent and just go off. But
no, you did a great job. We're thinking about doing some of these through the foundation, so I was just noticing how good you were at it. But anyway,
well, I just like the casual. I feel like now, I feel like in public affairs, well, not public affairs, but I feel like in social media, there was so much of the influencer thing where everything had to look so perfect instead of just like, this is the raw thing now.
Yes.
And this morning after I woke up, I was like, because I'm still in public affairs. I never get out. I've been in 10 years, but I was like, I think I'm gonna use Sundays now as a platform just to talk to my Muslim friends next week, and and live stream now, because we're always trying to put together these things where people gather and it's a big production, and this was seamless, just and great. Maybe we only had 10 people on at one time, but we can spread it more, I think,
Yeah.
and give more people a voice and do it without, I don't know.
Well, I think it was great, and thank you so much, and so fun to see you. You're as beautiful as ever, and keep posting things of Elizabeth and her performances because she's really talented. I mean, she is really talented. Were you a singer as well?
No, I don't sing. I can't even sing it, a hymn. So that
well, I don't know where she got it, but she's got it. She really does. And
I'm a tech girl. I'm not, I'm a totally different breed. I only know how to travel and do computers. So
now you have 4 kids, right?
Yeah.
And are 3 of them married now, or 2 of them?
2. Mm-hmm.
2. Okay. And so it's your other daughter who's not married,
right? Well, she's 16. Yeah.
Elizabeth.